Well, I don't know the explanation of why I don't turn on. So I'll just have to proceed. Can you hear me at all? Probably not. You can a little bit. I just might make one comment about the last time. You recall I gave the example of trying to explain the notion of adjusted procedural justice. Gave the example of the poker game, right? Where we took something out of each pot so that everyone could continue playing. And I think that has the sense that, well, that's a gambling game, and I tried to say that isn't so bad, but we're trying to illustrate something. But I think one still thinks it's external somehow to what's going on, because you have a notion of a poker game already. So it'd be nice to get a better example. So I talked about that with some people, and then it occurred to us, well, a better example, it's still related to games, but is the example where, say in professional baseball or football or something, the teams that end up in the bottom of the league have the first draft of the players who come up. And the idea of that is to even out the teams so they don't get too much discrepancy and so on. So we have a good game, so to speak. So that's an adjusting process. It does seem internal and connected with the point of having this whole activity. So you might think of it that way. Everybody knows that if they win, they're going to end up in the bottom of the draft, as it were, and if they lose, they'll get a chance to draw first, and things of that sort. I think that's a better example. Okay, well, I don't want to persist on that. They have to go on to Kant, and it's with some trepidation, actually, that to talk about Kant at all, because it is so difficult. But I thought I would try, perhaps unwisely, to make the attempt. So I know you'll find it difficult, and don't worry about it. You try to get what you can, and I hope eventually be able to see some of the main points. And today I do want to go over some main points about the text of groundwork. I also should say that there is now in the coop some copies, about 30 copies, I think, of the political writing. And I do want to talk about the social contract on Fridays, an idea of reason, along with Kant's notion of autonomy and freedom. Now, other people who we've read, I always like to say something at the beginning about them, so you have an idea of how I think they approach the subject, is that he's a poor boy. The others were sons of professional people, lawyers, and so on. Or of well-known figures, say like John Stuart Mill being the son of James Mill. But Kant's a poor boy. His father was a saddle maker. They lived in the artisan section of Königsberg, a rather poor section. You might say he was born on the wrong side of the canals. He had to walk across into town and that's where the poor people lived, the artisan class. And his parents were Lutheran, and he was saved, as it were, because someone noticed him as a kid and made sure he got an education, same to what was actually a kind of theological school, where for 11 years, for 10 or 8 hours a day, all they did was to study Greek and Latin, some mathematics, the idea being they would go on to be preachers, or if they were among the smart of those, they would become theologians or something. And eventually he went to the university at an early age of 16, and and he hated school. And it's a good case of an example. But some people, anyway, if you're smart enough, you can't be destroyed. If anything would have destroyed anybody, it would probably be the kind of schooling he had for 8 or 10 hours a day. He hated it, just a prison, and he always spoke of it with great resentment as he was older. Well, anyway, it's all the books that we read were all written in the 1780s, ones for which he was renowned, for almost all of them. There's a few in the 90s, like The Religion 93, and The Doctrine of Justice or Right, or The Doctrine of Virtue. They're two parts of the same book. Metaphysics of Morals was 1797. And there's this extraordinary period of time, 10 years, in roughly 1780 to 90, when all this was done. And in 81, he was 57 years old. So he began writing quite late. And it was an enormous effort for a short period of time. But then in the 70s, he didn't write. He wrote very few things. And he was changing his mind beginning around 1765. I don't know exactly what happened. Before that time, he was something of a Leibnizian, and then this dramatic change occurs in a philosophical view, and he presents in these writings a doctrine called transcendental idealism, which I shall not try to explain. It's extremely hard doctrine to understand, and there's a lot of argument today about its value and how to understand it. On my own part, I think it's a great thing. And Kant, along with other people, has come a natural wonder. And I would like to have more time to give some account of that, but all we're able to do is to focus on a few notions. But as I would understand the motivation of it, and I think one can say something about this, that is the motivation of transcendental idealism. I see it. I don't think this awfully eccentric view as what one might call a philosophical doctrine in defense of reasonable faith. It's a kind of an apologetics in the sense that one might think of in seminary or in Christian doctrine as a defense of faith. Now, it's not a defense of Christian faith, although there are aspects of that are defended. But it's a defense of reasonable faith. It's a defense, first of all, of our knowledge of the world, physical world, in both mathematics and in science, and it defends that against theeticism and also against the materialism of a kind of, against a doctrine of idealism of the kind of Barclay, which Kant sometimes refers to as material idealism as opposed to his transcendental idealism. And in the ethical writings, it's a defense of the moral law and of other ethical values that are based upon it, and a defense of our free will. And the problem is, of course, that in the 18th century, at other times, there always has been in philosophy a sense that there's a conflict between the determinism that appears to obtain, or seems to obtain in the case of the natural world, as developed, say, by Newtonian physics or other physical views, and freedom of the will. And part of transcendental idealism is a new perspective, philosophical view that presents a framework within which they might be reconciled. I think that's a major motivation of Kant's view, is much motivated by moral philosophy, the kind of values that it defends, in his sense, it defends by anything else. And also there is the religious view, the doctrine of reasonable faith, and if you read the critique of practical reason in particular, or the religion, which is in 1793, it's claimed that not only does he believe in some sense in those values, but he knows a great deal about Christian theology and has thought a lot about it and has tried to give an interpretation of it within this system of critical reason. So that's his motivation. Again, I indicated to distinguish him from these other people, each of whom have their own approach to things. And I don't think of Kant's view so much as a philosophical system, but a framework within which one is able to give an interpretation of and a defense of these different kinds of values and show how they hold together. And as a defense, it, I think, puts the view in a somewhat stronger position, because what you're able to do is to argue against certain views if they have not been shown, and within the context of reasonable faith, I think he holds that these values can be maintained. But all that I've realized tends to be misleading, perhaps, but I think that indicates the motivation of the critical philosophy as a whole, or at any rate as I'm trying to think of it. Now note, for example, at the end of chapter 1 of the groundwork, that there are 22 paragraphs in that, and that the last 3 paragraphs, if you think of his motivation there, as explained, the idea exists. Kant does not suppose that what I'm going on to talk about, the moral law and the categorical imperative procedure, he doesn't suppose that that's going to inform anybody of any procedure or law or ways of reasoning that they don't already know. What he thinks they're doing is giving kind of formula, kind of articulating in a more exact way forms of deliberation that we actually follow in everyday life. And he thinks that the ordinary person, whose natural reason is uncorrupted and is sound in some way, is able to reason about morals as well as the most educated person. Indeed, he says the most educated person, precisely because such persons know more, and they may be aware of lots of fancier doctrines with all kinds of distinctions, that they are more likely to go wrong than the ordinary person who follows with their natural reason. Because he says they get confused and so on by all these arguments of one kind or another, and they might be tempted into error as a result, or they may fall into error as a result. So he then asked the question, well, what's the point of studying moral philosophy and setting out an account of moral law if we already know it? And the kind of answer he gives there, which isn't the kind of answer always it gives, but the kind of answer he gives there is, well, innocence is easily deceived. And if we don't think about the basis of the moral law and how it's rooted in our reason, and how our reason is part of an essential part of our moral personality, if we don't understand that, then we may be persuaded by Socrates and other kinds of arguments not to follow the moral law. So the point then, as stated there, of moral philosophy isn't to explain to us the content of it, be able to do it, but to strengthen our hold on it. And to strengthen our hold on it by understanding what it is and how is it connected with our person, and how it's rooted in our nature as certain kinds of persons and so forth. In particular, how it's connected with our freedom, and how acting from the moral law displays and shows that we are free, and those kinds of things. If we understand that, then we will understand the basis of the moral law and we'll hold on to it. If we don't understand it, why, then we're an easy target, you might say, for Socrates history, and various arguments of persons of the world. So, in that sense, he sees it, you might say, as defense. Moral philosophy as defense of the moral law, and I hold upon it from, say, what he there calls the natural dialectic, but from certain variety of temptations of culture and civilization and so on. Kind of a Rousseauist streak in that. Rousseau made a tremendous impression on particularly Rousseau's Emile. So the moral law isn't a doctrine of man. It isn't not to be seen as an ethics of imperatives from some outside agent or source. It's a law we give to ourselves as beings of a certain sort, and that's what we have to understand. And in that sense, the view is a defense of faith. So rather, I might say moral faith, our capacity to hold on to the moral law against things that are tempted from us, and it does that by tracing it to its source in our person. Well, when one judges the if you read his writings, and particularly the political writings, you must be aware, of course, of where he comes from. He was born in Königsberg, Prussia, of Frederick the Great, and he's not going to hold in his opinions the kind of views that you hold. He's going to be from another world, and often you find his opinions, particularly how we ought to regard the sovereign and so forth, in the political writings as extreme. And I find them so, and I don't quite understand some things he says. But the question always is, when I say I don't understand it, I mean, I'm not quite sure how men, I think he must have been to hold these views. It's not, I don't understand the process of reasoning. I think there must be something I don't understand. But he is someone from another world, so the question that we have to ask is, as we ask of all of us, is one significantly ahead rather than behind our world? And if one thinks of it that way, then I think the answer in his case perhaps obvious enough. And I'm going to judge him appropriately in light of that. Well, I ought to go on. I've maybe perhaps spoken a bit too much about this kind of background. Can't tell. So, first thing I want to do is to give a very brief sketch of what I take the moral law to be, or at least a way to take it. And this will be a highly schematic presentation of it, but I hope it will enable us to have some idea of it, and then if I have time, I'll go on to talk about 6 conceptions of the good that can be related to different parts of how this law is set out. Now there are 3 things that I think have to be distinguished. One is the moral law itself, the other is categorical imperative, and the third is the categorical imperative procedure. And I'll sometimes will use the term CI procedure for short. Now those are 3 different things. The moral law I think of as an idea of reason that specifies a principle which applies to all reasonable and rational beings. I use the phrase reasonable and rational to indicate 2 kinds of reason that I'll distinguish in a moment. But then the moral law is an idea of reason that specifies a principle that applies to all reasonable and rational beings. And in that sense, it applies to God and the angels or any such beings, perhaps in other planets and so on, but we can leave that aside. The categorical imperative itself is, of course, an imperative, and as an imperative it is directed only to those reasonable and rational beings who experience the moral law as a constraint. That is, they desire to do things that are contrary to it. Now, the categorical imperative does not apply to God because God does not have any inclinations or desires that tempt God to act contrary to it. Therefore, since God does not experience the moral law as a constraint, the categorical imperative does not apply to God. This CI procedure is a procedure that applies the categorical imperative to our circumstances, that is, to our human circumstances, as finite beings with needs, and it takes into account the normal circumstances of human life. So the CI procedure is a procedure for applying the categorical imperative to us in our normal human circumstances as beings that have needs and desires and so on. Now, keep in mind throughout when Kant is talking about the CI procedure and the categorical imperative that he is concerned solely with the reasoning, the moral deliberation and so forth, of fully reasonable and rational human beings. And he's concerned only with a sincere agency, taking that, I think, for granted, although everyone doesn't agree with this, but I think he's assuming that. So that the idea of the CI procedure is a scheme to characterize the framework of deliberation that such agents implicitly use in their moral reasoning. Of course, such agents as those that are fully reasonable and rational. And Kant takes it for granted, I think, that in order to apply the CI procedure, to apply categorical imperatives then to the normal conditions of human life, that we must presuppose some moral sensibility on our part, and a sensibility that we share with other people. I think it's a misconception of the categorical imperative procedure to think of it as any kind of algorithm of any kind, set of explicit rules that by themselves, say, as debating rules, will trap liars and cheats, cynics and scoundrels into make false inferences or exposing of their hands or something like that. It presupposes some moral sensibility on our part, I think he believes, in order to be able to apply it. Now, I think, and I'm following others in this characterization of it, that it has 4 steps as follows. And I'll write it out as kind of a schema. At the first step, we have the agent's maxim, which by assumption is rational from the agent's point of view. That is to say, the maxim is rational given the agent's situation, actual situation, and given the alternatives that are actually available to the agent and the agent's actual desires, or what the agent wants. Also, we have to take into account the agent's abilities, opportunities, and so on. Also, Kant assumes of this maxim that it is sincere, that we're dealing with sincere agents. And what this means is that it reflects, or is the maxim, that the agent that actually describes the agent's action and the principle of it, as the agent would so describe them truthfully, as without deceit. In other words, the agent actually believes that this is the principle upon which the action is being undertaken. So that the maxim applies to sincere agents in that sense. So one can then put a maxim in the following form as sort of a general policy. I am to do X, say, in circumstances C, in order to bring about Y. And we might put it in a more complicated form, but that's all right for our purposes. That is, I am to do X in circumstances of kind C in order to bring about Y. That is, I am to take certain kinds of food at the dinner table and so forth and so on in order to keep myself healthy and strong, or something like that, or a variety of other things. But it's a sort of a general policy about what I am to do to achieve a certain end. That's the first step. Then, at the second step, one generalizes the maxim. So one says that everyone is to do X in circumstances C in order to bring about Y. And that everyone is to do X in circumstances C in order to bring about Y. So that whereas the maxim is directed to me and adopted on the basis of my desires and so forth and so on, at second step it'll be a general precept directed to everybody on this interpretation. Then at the third step, and this proceeds in accordance with the idea of what Kant calls in the groundwork the law of nature formula in Chapter 2. What one is to do is to turn the general precept at step 2 into a law of nature. So we get at the third step, everyone always does X in circumstances C in order to bring about Y, as if by a law of nature. So everyone always does X in circumstances C. So it's to convert it from a general precept, which is in the, say, imperative mood, into statement of a law of nature. Then we get the fourth step, and this is the way the most complicated and raises a lot of questions. But roughly the idea is this. We are to adjoin the law of nature at step 3, the one we just arrived at, to the existing laws of nature, as these are understood by us. And then we are to calculate as best we can what the order of nature would be if that law were adjoined to these other laws. So it is assumed that this new order of nature, that a result from adding of this law, has a kind of equilibrium state. That is, if we allow all these consequences of adding of this law to work out, then we end up with a different kind of social world than the kind that we actually have now. And we try to work out what it would be by the consequences of adding this other law to it. And we might call this new kind of social world a perturbed social world. It's arrived at by adjusting the laws of nature in our world in a certain way. Now, and after I go through this, I'll give an example to help clarify what all this is supposed to mean. Where I can now then state the categorical imperative in the following way. that we are permitted to act from our rational and sincere maxim at step 1 only if 2 conditions are satisfied. The first condition is that we must be able to intend as reasonable and rational agents to act from that maxim when we regard ourselves as a member of the perturbed social world and not our world. It is rational in our world by assumption, but it might not be rational in the perturbed social world. And we might not even be able to intend to act from it. In the case of the lying example, the deceitful lying example, Kant believes we can't even intend to act from it, because if you generalize the maxim of the deceitful lie, the practice of promising will no longer exist. It'll be undermined. It will no longer be possible. And a rational agent cannot, qua rational, intend to do what that agent knows cannot be done. So that agent will not be able even to intend to act on the maxim in the perturbed social world, although it can be done in our world. Or at least that's what Kant assumes in that particular case. So the first condition then is that, I'll do the other condition and I'll come back. The first condition is that we must be able to intend to act from the maxim in the perturbed social world. The second condition is that we must be able to will this perturbed social world, and we must be able to affirm it should we belong to it. So the 2 conditions, we must be able to intend to act from the maxim in the perturbed world, and we must be able to will that world. And we don't know what this latter thing means, but perhaps I should stop a moment. Do you have a question?
No, I'll leave it fine.
I realize this may be quite mysterious. Is it? Often mysterious. Yeah. Maybe I should keep going at any rate till I get through an example that I will discuss in some more detail. Then maybe you will see the point of it. But it's perfectly clear, I assure you. It's perfectly lucid if you just, I don't mean that you ought to see that it is such. I'm just saying it's just a matter of underneath all of the, Kant's philosophy is something like an I symphony where you have 5 bands playing at once, and you have to be able to identify the band you want to listen to, and then it all makes sense. All right, I'll proceed through with an example eventually, and then perhaps it'll be all right, or it'll be a little better. And of course, I don't know at this point, perhaps you haven't read the groundwork yet, and of course then it's going to be even more mysterious. I'm talking, of course, about chapter 2, the central part, about paragraph 31 to 79, which is a paragraph where the categorical imperative is discussed. And 80 is the beginning of where he talks about autonomy. And that's the part I'm not talking about. And I'm only talking about the first formulation of that, which is 31 paragraph through 45. 46 is the beginning of the second formulation. I'm only talking about those paragraphs. Now, the view is if we cannot if we cannot meet both of these conditions, then we cannot act on this maxim. That's roughly the point. Now, I give an illustration as Kant thinks of it, and perhaps the clearest one is the fourth one, which is about the duty of mutual aid. Now, consider the fourth example that this is in page 423 of the Academy edition, and that's in all of your text. Any text you have will have the equation. And the maxima to be tested and rejected is one that expresses indifference to the well-being of others who need our help and assistance. So what we have to decide is whether a maxim of indifference to others, that is, we ignore them, we don't help them, and when they need our assistance, whether or not that maxim will pass the test of the categorical imperative. And often such a maxim might be rational in the case of a person who knew that they didn't need the help of others. Perhaps they were very wealthy and they could pay for it. So for them, it might be rational to have a policy, a maxim, that is indifferent. Or one might imagine a society divided into parts, and one part holds considerable power and is able to take care of himself, or the other does not. If you knew that you belonged in the part that held and exercised a great share of wealth, then again, why you would not be different to everybody, you might say you would have a maxim that made it you different to those in the other part, or something of that sort. So such a maxim might be rational. And the question is, could we accept it? So the maxim is, I am not to do anything to help others or to support them in distress unless at the time it is rational to do so in terms of my own interests. Otherwise, I will not help them. Now, the perturbed world which is associated with this maxim is then a world in which no one ever does anything to help others in distress or for the sake of their well-being. And the same is thought to hold of everyone, and this just happens like a law of nature. They act on this maxim as if it were a law of nature, as it were, and that's the relevant equilibrium state. Now, Kant takes for granted that everyone in this social world knows what the laws of nature are, and it's important to be aware of this assumption, that is, that when a maxim is to be generalized and converted into a law of nature, then it's clear from how he discusses these matters, particularly in the case of the promising example, that this law is known by people, and they're able to work out what the consequences are. Now, if we make that assumption, they say, that he does, then Kant goes on to say that we cannot will, he thinks, the perturbed social world, which is associated with the maximum of indifference, because many situations may arise in that world in which we ourselves need love and sympathy and the help of others. So that in those situations, by a law originating from our own will, we would have robbed ourselves of what we require. It would be irrational for us to will such a world in which everyone, as if by a law of nature, is deaf to appeals for assistance. Irrational to do that, he said. Now, Kant doesn't say here very much about how the notion of rationality to be understood for why it's irrational. It says rather than a little about this. And indeed, the test as he actually describes it, I think, is too strong, because he makes it seem as if in the perturbed world we want to do something, or we want something very much, and our having it is as a result of some maxim that we hold, and when generalized becomes a law of nature. If that law blocks something that we now want, then he says that precept is rejected. Now the reason I think this is too strong is that all moral precepts are going to cross our interests and desires on at least some occasions. In most any social world that's in realm of nature at all like ours. So there's always going to be some conflict between the maxims that we act from and generalize, and our particular interests as they might arise in the social world in which everyone is acting on those maxims. So I think that the test is actually proposed in example 4 is a bit too strong. Well, it is too strong. I think, at least I don't know how to avoid saying that. Now, I think there are several ways out of this that one might try to amend Kant's view. He doesn't himself explore these, but the notion I want to emphasize that's important is the notion of willing a social world of a certain kind, and of being able to will a world that's in which everyone acts from precepts or principles of suitable generality that you yourself are prepared to affirm. Now, one way, which I think I won't discuss in great detail here, I'll indicate parallel at some point later, is that Kant often talks about the adoption of, or he sometimes, sorry, opposed to often, sometimes uses the phrase true human needs. And there are passages in the Doctrine of Virtue as if it appears he's reasoning in accordance with the idea of whether in this perturbed social world our true human needs are adequately taken care of by the precepts that we generalize. So rather than say that we reject the maxim, if it might cross our desires and interests of some sort, perhaps we ought to read the fourth example in saying that need in time of distress and help in times of distress, and in certain people in some cases is true human need, and that the reason why the maxim is to be rejected is because if from a suitably general point of view it doesn't take care of that need as opposed to fulfilling or satisfying some desire that isn't a need that we don't count as such, then it is to be rejected. So one might then get a test of the following sort. Can I will the perturbed social world associated with the precept of indifference, that is, where I don't help anybody, rather than a perturbed world associated with the precept of mutual aid, that is, a maxim enjoining me to help others in need? And in answering that question, I am taking into account not only my true human needs, which by assumption I take myself to have and everyone else to have. Or rather, in judging of those worlds, and to take into account only my true human needs. And presumably we have some account of that. So if we read, I think, the fourth and also the third example in this light, in an analogous light, then we could begin perhaps to make a more plausible case for the kind of view he is presenting, which seems to be open to this difficulty. Now the idea is this, that in applying the SCI procedure now, as now revised, we understand that any general precept, which is all like a moral precept, will constrain, of course, some of our actions on some occasions, as actions prompted by some of our desires. That's a feature of a moral precept which can't be avoided. What we must do, though, is to compare alternative social worlds and evaluate all the consequences, so far as we can, of willing one of these worlds rather than another. So in order to do this, we're going to have some account of true human need, and that will then enable us to make an estimate in some rough way what these consequences might be. That is a general picture of what I take the CI procedure to be, in a very schematic form, of course. Now I also believe, perhaps this is something that I project into it, that at this fourth stage of testing a maxim, where we are comparing these alternative social worlds, Kant supposes that there are two limits on information. The first limit is that we are to ignore the particular features of persons, including ourselves, in the making of that judgment. And we also ignore, and I think there's evidence for this in the text and for the practical reason. There isn't a lot of evidence, but some as to how things are stated, for ignoring the content of our particular desire. And I think the other constraint on information is that in the second critique, where it talks about we have to be able to will an order of nature in general. I think from where the text aids there, it's at the end of chapter 2 of the analytic, something called the typical judgment. If you want to look it up. It sounds as if presupposing that we don't know the place that we will have in that order of nature. Now that's something perhaps I project into it because it's somewhat analogous to the constraints on information that parties are subject to in their revisional position. But I think one who reads these parts of the text, that this idea is not being actually asserted or presupposed, is either implicit or very close to the surface. It depends on one's judgment there. He doesn't actually assert it in unmistakable fashion. Well, now, that, perhaps I stop for a moment, about almost 3 anyway. Is there anything you wish to ask? Yes.
Yeah. Just about the last comment about ignoring particular features of persons. Does that mean that Kant has to have some sort of idea about a general human being or a real general rational wants? Because you're going to generalize for everyone, and you're not taking your own personal interests as typical or the ones to follow? What ones would you follow? What ones would a person follow? Deciding whether it's rational to will of the world or not.
Well, what I think you need is that unless you, if you go the way I would suggest that it has to, you would have to develop some kind of account of what the true human needs are.
Okay, that goes for the others. Right.
Now I haven't said anything about what those are, but we get a hint from, say, the fourth example, that we need, where he puts it there in some occasions, of sympathy, but one might say that we need to live in a social world in which others are going to come to our assistance when we need it in this way. We might be drowning, or we might be starving, and one characterize what these are. Now, there isn't very much to go on there in that example. There's a little bit to go on, a little bit more to go on in the third example, where he seems to suggest that it's important for us to develop our talents, for example, and that would be a kind of need for certain purposes, although it's possible to imagine a society where that isn't done. But I haven't attempted to give any account of it for him that, in his own terms, would work. So what one would have to do would be to develop one on one's own, and or a view that would go along with him and splice it in. Now, I might mention, of course, the thing that's in the back of my mind is that the account of primary goods is intended to do something quite like that. I mean, it is intended to be things that people need in a certain kind of society that one is trying to develop a conception of political justice for. Well, perhaps I better stop here. I have the feeling that I haven't been able to make it clear at all. Unfortunately, I think it may become more so once you've read the